How are the candidates doing?
Pretty
Not so
good.
bad.
Sarah's
Yeah.
uncontested. Joe, I think you have a challenger, but I assume you're out doing the job as if you were running from behind, right?
Always.
That's the
Always.
way to do it.
Well, Joe, one of your wonderful, wonderful constituents said I could put my sign in her yard. And I said, she says, oh, I live on North Avenue. I said, well, that's good. But it turned out to be your district. Sylvia Olden, you know Sylvia?
I know the name, and I'm pretty sure I've looked her up at the house, but
She's fabulous.
She's wonderful.
Yeah.
She's in her 90s, and her grandfather built the house we live in.
Yeah.
oh, no way.
Yes, they're the
Yep.
original. They were the original, German families that were about 25 or 30 that settled in this neighborhood over here. Yeah.
Wow.
She's got a long history.
Yeah, she's quite something. Her father ran for governor, one of the first people to run as a Democrat in the 50s. But
Yep.
his running against the incumbent George Aiken.
Oh,
Wow.
Because they were friends,
yeah.
they would ride together in the same vehicle to their debates.
That's quite the Vermont story.
Isn't it?
Well, at some point, you should make a point to get to know
You
her.
really
She's just
should.
Yeah.
chock full of, I think it's 189 North, which is, it's right near, what,
Right across from Crowley. It's literally
Yeah.
right across
Yep.
from Crowley,
Mhm.
straight ahead.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
and she's still out and about and fairly active.
All the neighbors shovel her snow for her, so she gets a lot of help. But
Good.
she still goes to church. She's a Unitarian and just quite a person of incredible energy and positivity. He's a very positive person.
Yes.
Lovely.
I haven't heard from Zariah. I'm assuming she had concurred, so I'm just assuming she'll be along in a minute.
Hmm.
Now what I do with my agenda here. Oh, here we go. Okey doke. You have to wait a couple more minutes.
Was hoping the snowbanks would hold up to March 1st to
I know,
keep the lawn
my
signs
signs are all
intact.
floppy.
Between the
Well,
wind and the melting snow, mine out in my yard is sideways.
If it gets cold enough again, there are people out there who have these drills that are made just for drilling in these signs.
I was
Contingency
saying to
plans.
somebody, I'm not sure why we call them lawn signs for town meeting in Vermont.
No signs, really.
Yeah, not lawn doesn't work.
Mhm.
I'm drawing on the warmth of the special election to get me through the next week and a half.
I'll be curious to hear tomorrow afternoon how many ballots we've got in.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've heard.
1,200 as of today. The whole
Okay,
state.
that's still pretty low.
Pretty low. Yeah.
It's gonna be a lower turnout, I'm
I think
guessing.
people also need a little more time because the ballot questions are kind of complicated.
Yeah, I've
Mhm.
gotten tons of questions on that, so.
Yeah.
Are you still sending us something on TIFF or should I just wing it with the other stuff I have?
Have you been provided with anything yet?
Well, just that email I sent you the other day, but nothing.
Did you get a frequently asked questions document yet from the mayor's office, maybe?
I don't think so, unless recently or,
It would have been this week, I think, but someone else just put it into graphic format, which is a helpful piece. It's still intended to be, an informational piece. It's not like
Okay.
it's not, since it's coming from the city, it can't be kind of campaign promotional
Yeah.
type. It's really informational, but it's it asks commonly asked questions. So frequently
Okay.
asked questions. Yeah.
Well, I'll
I'll get that out to you.
Right. That would be great. And I'll look at, sort of the question I'm getting is, so what happens if it doesn't pass? And people mistakenly think, well, there's money for other stuff, and that's not the case.
Yeah, what I keep telling folks is there's a few options. The project doesn't go forward. It gets scaled way back and we come back to the voters with a different request, or it's part of a capital bond request that the voters have to put on their property tax bill.
Yep.
Or you have huge systems failures, which are possible because we have infrastructure that's over 130 years old. Below ground. So we have some very old infrastructure. And if that stuff fails, then you have to deal with the disruption and the costs, which are unexpected at that point. So then we have to deal with it.
Well, I want to take a field trip to the ravine sometime if somebody will let us do that. I don't know if we can, but.
Yeah, as long as you wear your hard hats, you're okay.
Yeah.
Maybe a life jacket might be a good idea.
Wetsuit.
Yeah.
Headlamp.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm hoping Councilor Hightower will be along shortly. Maybe one of you could text to see if she's coming along and we'll get started.
I can text.
Okay, thanks. So I would move to have somebody approve the agenda.
So moved.
Okay, second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I'll let Joe finish his text.
Okay.
Okay, I would move for approval of the minutes.
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. I don't see anybody here for public forum. I think it's just us, but if there is, let me know. Okay, the next item was kind of the follow-up on the resolution that we had around researching tax policy issues. And last meeting, Brian updated this. One of the consultants we had thought of, Deb Brighton, is not available. They had suggested Public Assets Institute and Steve Jeffrey, and we've not done much sort of follow-up on that. So I was sort of looking for ideas about kind of how to approach this. And that's really what I'm looking for, thoughts on how do we sort of dig in, outline what it is we're looking for. And so I don't know if either of you have got any sort of suggestions on that.
I will confess that with other things on my plate, I haven't talked to anyone other than Deb Brighton. But I think from the more I've thought about it, it would help greatly to have a good project sort of scope of work or a description of what's the main assignment. So if I do approach, or when I approach Paul Celo and Steve Jeffrey and ask them, make sure they're feel capable and it's a good fit, that they're the ones who could do that. So that would be helpful. I don't know. I would just start asking around if they say this isn't really their thing, but Deb Brighton thought that they'd be a good team to do this. So based on how I described it to her, she followed it because anytime tax policy gets discussed anywhere, she follows it because that's her thing.
Well, from my perspective, I'm looking for many things, but someone who can also sort of dig in on the net impacts of some of our revenue raising. And in particular, obviously the one with a lot of sensitivity is property tax. But what I don't understand, or I'm not sure we understand well, is how the education homestead credit works with that. I mean, we know how it works generally, but sort of specifically, how much information can we get, do we have on the individuals who get it? And so, and you know, it really came to light, I thought, a lot this year with kind of the lag that we faced as a result of the reappraisal. And then when, and it was very interesting, and actually, Catherine and her staff, and I'm not sure if it was Nancy or whether it was somebody else on her staff, helped us really narrow the band of people that were affected by the lag. And they were able to do that by looking at, did they receive the credit? How much credit did they get? What was the value of their house? What was the value of their taxes? So that was kind of a starting place. And it sort of, the thing that I found interesting was, obviously, the amount of credit you get is proxy possibly for your income, meaning the more credit you get, probably the less income you have. And so somebody to at least begin help us sort of analyzing that would be useful. Burlington residents get there's a high percentage that get the credit, but it's quite varied. It's quite varied from $100 to, I've forgotten the maximum, is it $4,000, I think?
Yeah.
And all of that math just boggles me in the sense of, you know, what does that mean? You know, is it being helpful? And I think part of that for me is also looking at, does the state formula keep up with a city like Burlington? And again, I can't figure any of that math out. So that would be sort of in one aspect that I would want to be looking at, you know, and then who gives us our other revenue? I mean, you know, it astounded me, and I never thought about it, how much revenue the city gets from parking. Because, you know, COVID brought that up, which I just thought was sort of an interesting thing to be so hit by lack of parking. There's obviously rooms and meals. You know, do we have room in the rooms and meals? To be looking at something different. You know, that's kind of come up actually relative to short-term rentals, and there's jurisdictions that have additional taxes for short-term rentals. So it's, and I don't know the best way, way to approach this. And of course, I'm always a little boggled with our open meeting laws around how to have like sort of a working conversation around it. I mean, since Joe and I spent a lot of time on it, he and I could have a meeting and talk about it. I mean, that's one option, and just I guess assume have to publicize it and try to come up with at least a set of questions that we're sort of looking at.
Yeah.
But, and there's the obvious, which is, you know, how much research can somebody do for how much money, I guess.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And it seemed like the other overarching question is, what can a city do to make the way it funds its services more fair, like just
Mhm.
overall fairness, right? I think was
Mhm.
what I read in that resolution was what, you know, the idea of tax fairness, so that it's more based on ability to pay. Obviously, we don't have the authority to go to an income tax, but maybe that becomes, you know, what you put out there.
Mhm.
Well, that's why that's definitely part of it. And so that's why I think it's so critical to understand the income sensitivity of the homestead credit, because really that is intended to create fairness. Now, how much it does or doesn't is the question of the day, because while it's not an income tax, in theory, it's based on your income and on your ability to pay.
Mhm.
I think that's the kind of thing that we need to walk through, because you get more credit if you have less income. And I don't know how that matches really, and lots of states do not have it. So I don't, I do believe it creates more fairness. That's sort of on a relative scale,
Sure. Sarah, I'd be open to, I think we could revisit some of the whereas and resolve clauses where we kind of laid out what
Yep.
we'd like to look at. And then maybe lay out some clearer guardrails that we would want to go to a consultant with to see if we can sort of have a stronger framework for what that research might look like.
Okay, well, maybe what we can do, Joe, offline is try to pick a day. We certainly could and would welcome Zariah to join us, but the two of us could, maybe just have a meeting and people can tune in and hear us talk if they want to,
Mhm.
and try to kind of narrow that. I think that's a good approach, taking that resolution and just trying to focus it and, focus it on, I think the fairness and equity is accurate, but needing to understand how we raise revenue now relatively is important.
And did you all approve? You didn't approve a budget per se, but
No, we didn't.
so you may go back to the council with a request for council initiative funds or something like that to say, we do
Mhm.
need a consultant. We think it's going to cost X. Can we get that funding? So,
Yes.
Yeah.
yeah. So.
I mean, at the time we got the resolution, we had no idea, and we still don't. So I think getting the questions out there and then asking somebody to help us, and maybe she can't do it, but maybe somebody like Deb can at least eyeball the questions and help us make sure we're not too far afield in what we're thinking. And I'm sure
Mhm.
somebody like Steve or Paul would do that as well. And I have no idea who else is out there in the big wide world that does that kind of analysis. I see we have somebody who's would like to join the public forum. So let's close out this item, and I'm fine with that. So Joe, you and I will maybe in the next week try to narrow a date or so that we could
Sure.
talk about that, and
That sounds good.
we'll do it in between the regular meeting. Okay, so we have someone who'd like to speak. Our own Jess Simon, who would like to speak.
Hi, Counselor
Yeah,
Carpenter
hello.
and McGee. Hi, Brian.
Yeah.
Or Director Pine. I suppose I should be official. Thanks. Thanks for letting me speak. I just wanted to make a quick comment about just cause eviction, which I guess I can do now and not wait until the agenda item. I'm Jess Hyman from the Fair Housing Project and Housing Advocacy Programs of CVOEO, and I was very excited to see the charter change moving a little bit in the legislature. And I just wanted to raise a concern, which I'm guessing is shared here, about some of the additions that were put into the charter change, most especially the one related to the probation period. First off, I think just the language of calling it a probation period isn't really fair. It makes the assumption that someone is not a good tenant until they've proved themselves after a year, which I don't think is the right tone to set for our renters. And then also my concern is that if just cause wouldn't apply during that first year of tenancy and non-renewal wouldn't count, wouldn't be included, that there's no real protection under just cause for someone within that first year or at the end of their year. So I'm hoping that that can be adjusted as it takes its next steps. So that's all I want to say.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks, Jess.
I appreciate that. And when we kind of walk through that, I can sort of give you my 2 cents of, you know, what I heard in the varied committee meetings that I went to.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So, Councilor McGee, we were going to have you walk through your proposed ordinance change.
Sure.
And I think, you know, for today, it's really just to sort of lay it out there in terms of what are you trying to accomplish? What are you proposing? Part of the referral to us also asks the city attorney's office to do an analysis. And that won't come until April, but so I thought this meeting we could kind of walk through what you're thinking. And then I think starting in March, after we finish this, we can strategize about who we want to invite in to speak to us. And I see that happening in multiple months. But we should sort of focus on, okay, who else do we want to hear from?
Sure.
So if you want to just start working at the top, and
Do you,
I don't know if it's best just to let you go through it and then we can ask you questions, or you want us to ask you questions as we go along.
sure. Borrowing from the legislature, I guess it's up to us. If you want to just interrupt me at certain sections, I think that's probably fine because it's so long. I'll go through a section, we can stop and talk about it, and then we can
Okay.
go through others. Great. Do you want me to share my screen or just follow along separately? Do you have it up there?
I have it, but I don't know if
Okay.
since we don't have others with us.
Christine, were you able to post it to the webpage?
Yes, it's on the webpage. Sometimes the website lags in time a little bit. So if
Okay.
someone wanted to go on and make sure it was there, if it isn't showing up yet, then I'd recommend sharing your screen because this is being
Okay.
recorded. But sometimes it takes a day for the
It is-
website to update.
It is up there
Oh,
under
great.
supporting documents now.
Great.
So why don't I'll just walk through it and
Okay.
just I guess I won't have the Zoom on my screen, so just call out if there are any questions.
Okay.
Great. So starting on line 3, this shows that this would be a strike all of the current camping ordinance that prohibits camping in parks. It would, on the first page here, outlines the city's commitment to addressing houselessness while acknowledging the need to treat folks with dignity, and that, you know, I think the most important part of this section is the clause that says that it is the policy of the city that no person should be arrested for sleeping or camping on public property, and that sleeping or camping as a result of houselessness should not be criminalized. So this essentially would decriminalize camping on not just city parks, but all city-owned land. And the last paragraph of this section also states that where exigent circumstances exist in the period from October 1 to May 1, there shall be no removals for any person who is not eligible for state-provided emergency housing unless, 1, the city provides at minimum an alternative location to shelter within city borders, 2, transportation for person and property to that location, and 3, direct support with moving any and all belongings to the new location. So that is the first section, the purpose, policy, and general provisions. I can stop before we go into the definitions.
Well, sort of two major questions I've got. One is this starts out with a presumption that people who may be camping on the land are houseless, which is not always the case. And living right next to Lundy Park, I've on numerous occasions seen campers, maybe presumptive, but I think I'm accurate that I'm presuming are not necessarily houseless. I mean, they have a fully stocked get up and drove there with camping equipment. And so I think, again, we just need to make that. The other thing, and I think this will come through more legal analysis, is how do we get at, if camping is prohibited, how do you prohibit it? And so these are rhetorical questions. I don't think we're going to debate them all tonight, but I think that's a fundamental question around if it's prohibited to camp there or anywhere, you know, how does that get exercised?
You mean from like a posting the land perspective, or?
Well, I think that's a part of it. If that's a route that we go, I mean, there's different strategies. So I'm interested to hear your strategy. For instance, Montpelier deals with it differently. It is still prohibited. They just have an approach with certain campers. So there's different strategies, I think, and I'm just wanting to toss out the questions.
Sure.
Because I think in pursuing this, we want to hear from a number of others, including perhaps how other communities have approached this.
Sure. So I've kept note of those, and
Yep.
I can move into the definitions now.
Okay.
So beginning on line 39 on page 2, the first definition we have here is regarding camping. That's the placing and use of any bedding, sleeping bag, or other material at a place to serve as a sleeping area, as well as the placing and use of any tent, lean-to, or other structure or vehicle at a site to serve as a sleeping or living area. Definition 2 here is sufficiently posted. That means that signs or placards designed and situated as to give reasonable notice that camping is prohibited on the area, such signs to be posted at a minimum at the corners of and at the regularly used entry points to the property. 3 defines high sensitivity area. So this is another sort of layer of camping prohibition that exists outside of what the city posts as prohibited. And those areas are a location where the health and safety impacts of camping create exigent circumstances. Now, subsection 4 here outlines what exigent circumstances are. So in the interest of time, I won't go through each one, and I think these could be amended to add or remove these bullets, some of them. But essentially, exigent circumstances mean conditions of a camping site that pose an immediate and substantial threat to human life, health, and property, or the ecology and environmental sensitivity of the area on and or directly impacted by the campsite. These have outlined certain areas here: public health, public safety, environmental protection, with a number of scenarios that could be included under each of these.
So, Councilman McGee,
Mhm.
sort of stepping back a minute, is your approach assuming that the city will allow camping in certain places?
I think that is a conversation that needs to be had. I think, it seems to me like we haven't been able to, I think that is a harder conversation for us to identify land where we're going to say explicitly, this is where you can camp. I think right now we have sort of unwritten policies that say that we take a hands-off approach with campsites that exist within the city, which, leaves a sort of open-ended and pretty precarious situation for folks who are sleeping outside. So I think this doesn't necessarily say that we can't have that conversation of the city saying, you can camp here, and this is where we're going to provide services and such. But I think this is to also acknowledge that folks are sleeping in our parks right now. They are sleeping on their city-owned lands, and we don't currently have clear policies or guidelines for campers or for city staff who come upon a campsite. So I think that is the primary purpose of this, is to really get these protections on the books for folks, and also offer the clarity for city staff. Because while we currently have unwritten policies that have sort of a hands-off approach to campsites, that folks could leave the city that are currently prioritizing that sort of approach, and that could change in the future. So I think it's important for us to put something like this on the books.
Well, just a comment, and again, there'll be more conversation. We do have a policy. Now we can agree or not agree whether it's, whether it's how it should be embedded in city governance, but we do have a policy, and we can agree or disagree on whether it should be changed. So I think those are fundamental questions that need to be answered as part of this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. The other piece that I would like to point out in subsection 4 here, on line 60, that conditions that can be readily remediated shall not be deemed exigent circumstances unless they rise to an immediate and substantial threat using the public health, safety, and environmental factors stated below. This essentially means that if the city identifies a campsite that has these exigent circumstances that would constitute removal of a campsite, that campers be offered the ability to remediate those concerns before the decision to remove a campsite is made. I think this is a pretty important protection that, acknowledges that the city has some responsibility to outline what we deem as public health hazards, public safety hazards, and then provide the resources for folks to be able to remediate those, whether that's waste removal or other sort of sanitation services.
Again, I think as conversation, I mean, that fundamentally says there is permission to camp. And I think as we proceed in this, we're gonna have, in my opinion, have to really have that conversation, because there's a decision tree depending on how that goes with an ordinance.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, what I'll just say, currently we have an unwritten rule of permitting camping until we see a situation where it rises to this immediate concern, and then we don't really have a set of policies that offer a path forward that is respectful and dignifying for folks sleeping outside. So I think, it's important for us to have this written in, because I think, we saw over the last couple of years a conversation that sort of snowballed into, we're just going to allow folks to camp, and then suddenly it turned into a situation where we couldn't do that anymore. And I think the outcome is something we all want to avoid in the future, and I think that's what the goal of this policy is. So I'll just leave with that note, and I can move on to section C here, which outlines camping in public parks with designated campsites shall be regulated by the city's applicable ordinances, rules, and regulations. And also says that in all other lands owned or controlled by the city, it shall be unlawful to camp if the campsite is in a high sensitivity area or the property is sufficiently posted to provide notice that camping is prohibited. So this is, I think, where the city gets the power to say where camping won't be allowed, that it doesn't necessarily say that camping is allowed on all public lands. And I think can sort of address some of those concerns that this change to the ordinance would automatically allow camping in all of our parks.
I mean, I do see that as kind of the fundamental question. I think parks are probably in that fashion easier to deal with because they're fairly well defined. And it's sort of everything else that's less than defined.
I'm going to jump in. Sorry, just because I apologize, I'm a half hour late. I got the time wrong, clearly. Y'all are already in the middle of the discussion. So if you can just orient me, are we talking through this? And we're clearly talking through this. And is the purpose, what are we trying to achieve?
Well, I think it's really is for Joe just to introduce it to us and the public. I mean, I think we've got a lot of work to do. It's really the first public time we've discussed it. So he's just walking through each of the sections and sort of explaining what his intent was, and we know we're expecting an analysis from the city attorney. And then at the end of this discussion, I'd like the three of us to talk about kind of the next steps. I mean, how do we get more information, and who do we want more information from, that kind of thing. But it's mostly just to understand what it is he's proposing. And I've been just tossing out sort of generic questions or rhetorical questions, not that I see us sort of debating them tonight, but just kind of are just what's kind of risen to my head.
Great. Thank you for letting me interrupt.
No, join
Go ahead,
right in.
Joe. Didn't mean to
No,
slow your roll.
totally fine. Sarah, did you have anything else for?
No,
section
just
two?
just my comment was that
Yeah.
I see that as a significant area of conversation.
Mhm. Okay. So I'll move into enforcement. Essentially, the enforcement action that could potentially be taken if the section is violated is the removal of a campsite, but with the caveat that any enforcement officer has to follow the procedures laid out in this section to ensure that that any removal doesn't happen wrongfully. So I can walk through. How granular would you like me to be with this?
Well, again, there's sort of two processes for consideration when it comes to the potential of camping on public land, which is it an emergency situation, or is it that somebody just wants to camp, you know? And we've seen that in some of the public parks. So there's different treatment, and I'm just sort of tossing that out as something
Sure.
for observation.
Sure. I think,
I mean,
you know,
you know, maybe it seemed, but in my neck of the woods, we get college kids who just like to sleep overnight out, you know, and it's not an emergency situation. So I just think as we cast this, you know, there's sort of several ways we're going to have to think about some of this.
And I don't know that, I don't know if emergency situation versus not is a good way to go about differentiating that, just because I think that's really subjective.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if instead, like, I think that there's popular spots to go camping, you know, that are on the lake or something like that, that are more likely to be camped at if you're doing it for leisure for the night or the weekend. And so I think the better way to handle that is actually through not allowing camping at those kind of like highly wanted sites. And then I think we could avoid kind of having that more subjective measure of emergency in there.
mm-hmm.
Well, and I think, again, when I was in section 2, sort of the fundamental is for the city is, are we going to allow camping at certain spots or not? And so that's, I think, soon enough a conversation that we're going to have to really drill down into.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if this is the time, but I mean, I don't know how much you all started with, but it's like there's so many. I guess I more know what's in my neck of the woods, but you know, thinking about Centennial Woods or thinking about the 127 bike path, like there's so many campsites where we are allowing semi-permanent almost camping. So it seems like we are allowing it without allowing it, so it feels we are to craft an ordinance that doesn't reflect that reality.
Well, and one of the comments I had made is, I think it'd be useful to talk to some other communities who are dealing with it or who have had to deal with it. Kind of, I mean, because there's just differing approaches, including Montpelier, who's probably the closest to us. I don't know if there's others in Vermont. I haven't done that piece of homework yet.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think that's certainly an area that we can come back to and talk about more in depth. I think the important piece of Section D on enforcement is really the idea here that campsites, if they are in sort of a community type setting, sorry, there's a little background noise. Thanks, E. That if camping is in sort of a community type setting where there are multiple campsites in a particular area, that each of those campsites should be considered individually if there are the exigent circumstances that are outlined in the definitions, unless, of course, the exigent circumstances have to do with all of the campsites taken together, that they need to be considered as a single campsite. Each campsite has to be considered individually. So we couldn't just say, all right, this exigent circumstance exists on this campsite, therefore all of you can now no longer camp in this area, which I think is an important clarification that we should have in this policy. Okay, so I can move into Section E. Folks are ready for that. This lays out the procedures for city staff, enforcement officers to follow if a campsite is found either in a prohibited area or a sufficiently high sensitivity area. The keys here are, as soon as somebody comes across a campsite and determines that that it is in a prohibited area, that the camper is given a 30-day notice, and 14 days from the notice, in that window, they have the opportunity to appeal a decision that's made. And that appeal can be made at any city administrative office, and the request goes to the Parks Commission. So this sort of gets at, I think, some concerns that were raised, and I think came up in our debate when this was referred to the committee. I think Councilor Mason mentioned that right now an appeal could really be brought by the ACLU because the policy was negotiated with the ACLU, but there is no mechanism short of filing a motion in court to appeal a decision for removing a campsite. So this institutes a level of appeal that is accessible for folks to be able to challenge a removal decision. And so if it's found that a campsite needs to be removed after folks are offered additional shelter or a shelter referral, their things are to be stored for 90 days. And So that's essentially what this section lays out. And happy to take any questions or record any questions for us to discuss later.
Well, again, I think we're going to need to spend, because not all places are going to be created equal, which is to say, and I have this feedback, it will not be acceptable to the Parks Commission that we leave somebody camping for 30 days in the middle of a public park that has the public in it, in and out all day long. So I think, you know, there's a lot of nuance there, you know, that we're going to have to parse out. If a park is intended to be prohibited for camping and its use is public, it may be incompatible with leaving an encampment there for that length of time. So again, not all places are going to be equal in how we approach this. If in fact the council decides, it depends on how affirmatively we make decisions on whether we allow camping on city land or not.
And maybe I just have a question around that, which is born out of ignorance, which is maybe around, yeah, your intention, Joe, and also just definition. And I'm sorry if I missed that earlier. And the thing is, the parks versus city-owned land, and like what the differentiating line is, and
Sure.
what you're hoping to see out of that.
Yeah. So what this does is it creates sort of two different definitions for areas where camping is prohibited. It lays out first areas where the city posts specifically that camping is prohibited. So that could be, for example, right now that we have camping prohibited in all public parks, and that is posted at minimally at the entrances, I believe. This would state that the boundaries of an area where the city explicitly states that camping is prohibited has to be sufficiently posted so that somebody would know that camping is prohibited in that area. So I see that still being, you know, certain bounds of our public parks. You know, we could post the four corners of City Hall Park or Battery Park. And that's not to say, you know, we could prohibit camping there, but I think an important piece of this policy to understand is that there's no fine, or we wouldn't arrest people for sleeping in City Hall Park, for sleeping in Battery Park. We wouldn't arrest people for sleeping on other city-owned land. So I think that is an important piece to outline here. And then it also outlines high sensitivity areas. So if an area has some sort of, if there's an environmental protection concern with a certain area, if there are sort of these exigent circumstances which outline public health, public safety, and the environmental concerns, but maybe the area isn't specifically posted as being prohibited, it still outlines this process for city staff to go through making that determination.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Well, I think there's a, again, you know, there's arresting somebody, or there's asking somebody to move or move on within a shorter period of time. So I think those are all the sort of details that we've got to parse out, depending on, again, where it is.
Sure.
and what's been offered for mitigation if, depending on who the camper is.
Mhm. Yeah, so I think the other important piece here is that I think the intent behind this also put some responsibility on the city to provide waste removal at certain locations, and post where that can be accessed, and also provide sharps containers for safe disposal of needles. So I think that is these are two components where we're currently sort of having a gray area in terms of what the city's responsibility is in addressing some of these things that could rise to an exigent circumstance or an emergency situation. We can sort of clarify and codify what the city's responsibility will be to address those concerns.
Again, I think we've got some fundamentals to go back to, because that presumes that we've affirmatively allowed camping in that area. So if we are not affirmatively allowing it, what is the city's responsibility? So I think that's a big area where we need clarification.
Sure. I think the intent of this is to provide that clarification and acknowledge that, the city has done this up to this point pretty haphazardly in a way that has left a lot of folks in the lurch. And, I think we need to acknowledge that while sheltering on public land is not a solution to houselessness, it is always going to be part of our response to houselessness. And this policy would acknowledge that and provide for some basic sanitation needs that we all have. So we can definitely discuss that in more detail. So that is it for the ordinance language. There's the other operational policy document, which maybe we can, I think that could be worked on separately and sort of could use the input of city staff to carefully hone that. So, I'm open to having more of a discussion right now, or maybe outlining how we want to go forward and bring folks in to discuss this. And I'll just note, I was just going to note that, the invitation has been extended by the Parks Commission to have a similar sort of presentation in the second week of March. So I'm planning to attend for that. And
is that the March 8th date?
yes, yeah. So, I think there are certainly areas where further clarity could be provided. I think there's definitely some nuance that we can discuss. But I think, it's important for us to keep the overarching intent and framework of this as maintaining dignity and respect for folks who are sheltering outside, and making sure that we are as clear as we can possibly be in terms of what and where the city will allow for camping, and what services the city will be required to provide in conjunction with that. So that is just one note that I hope we can sort of use as a guide as we continue these conversations, and if any changes are made, as long as the the foundation is maintained of that intent, then I think we'll be well served.
I'm somewhat struggling with, again, how do we get some consensus or thinking or have a broad community discussion on what we will or will not allow for camping. And a lot of the work you've done makes some assumptions, and from my point of view, I'm not sure we're there yet. So I'm struggling with how do we get there? What's the best forum to have that discussion? Who do we invite in to further that discussion?
Mhm.
I mean, if, as an example, we do not change the ordinance, we do what Montpelier did and sort of work around the ordinance, that's one guiding path. There may be another guiding path if we presumptively say, okay, here's a few places we do allow camping. Brian, I'd be appreciative of any thoughts you have in terms of the approach for this discussion.
Yeah, sure. The issue isn't certainly on a practical day-to-day basis is one that Lacey and her team will certainly deal with, and she's on as I believe she was on as a panelist, but I can't recall if it was a panelist. But Lacey's team is critical to this discussion. Parks and Recreation staff are critical because I think they interact quite a bit, and I don't know that the DPW has as much direct interaction really with folks who are camping, although I could be mistaken about that. And certainly the city attorney is an important player here. As much as it's has some overlap and crossovers to the other work that we do at CEDO, it hasn't really been a focus for us, but we'd be happy to engage in a more of a dialogue with other stakeholders or to help convene that to ensure that that the process is informed by a variety of perspectives, for sure.
Yeah, I don't know if Soraya, you have any thoughts on that as well, just sort of what's the best approach? Oh, I see Lacey has joined us. That's great.
Yeah, I don't have, I guess like the idea of at least talking to two other communities, and then certainly having Lacey and anyone else in this city weigh in. Yeah, and then I think agree with Joe's overall mandate of our goal.
Are any of you, other than Montpelier, are you aware of other communities in Vermont that have developed policies around this?
Montpelier's the one that I'm most familiar with. I think we've seen stories of other Vermont communities who haven't had a policy, and maybe Lacey can speak to that.
So the only other community I think is doing something around camping on land is Brattleboro. I can dig a little deeper into maybe who the contact is, but they reached out to us originally about how we were working with folks. So just that might be one area to explore. And then I thought about, in terms of getting the greater public involved around, just like, I wondered about NPA meetings. I don't know how often folks are engaging there, but just as a way to get a broader public thought around the idea of having sanctioned camps or allowing camping in parks. Because I do think that it's an important issue for the city to really look at and consider really weighing all of the options, because I think it's something that we need to address. So thanks.
Thank you.
Lacey, maybe if you have a contact for Brattleboro and we could talk to Dan about Montpelier, at our next meeting, we could maybe try to invite at least representatives from those two communities and talk to them. I don't know if there's others, if people have thoughts on,
I'd be certainly willing to invite the advocates from Montpelier who contributed to the Montpelier policy, and to a certain degree, this policy was drafted to acknowledge where they felt some of the key protections were left out of the Montpelier policy. So, that is a consideration that we made in drafting this, and I'd be happy to have them come and speak to the importance of some of those.
Well, and I'd also be very interested in it as well from the city perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So a city person would be useful as well.
Sure.
Well, we can try maybe to see who we can get for the next meeting, which is not sure when that is, but it's March. Is it March 17th?
March 17th.
St. Patrick's Day. Used to be a wild and woolly day here in the city of Burlington. Not so much anymore, but depends on whether UVM's in session or not in session, and whether what else is going on. So do we have other questions for Joe, or do we want to sort of move on? And so we can try to look at those two, at least those, bringing people in from those two communities.
Sure. And I think it would be maybe good for us to have a first round of a conversation with the folks from the Parks Commission and the Parks Department in March. We can start that conversation, and then maybe once the city attorney is able to provide feedback in April, we can figure out what the April meeting might look like.
Yep.
If indeed it is this is the makeup of the committee, if that is our decision to be making in April.
Forgot about that too.
So, yeah, I think, we can certainly acknowledge that there are lots of conversations that we need to have before folks are comfortable moving this forward, while also trying to balance that with the urgency of making sure that we're doing everything we can to get these protections in place for folks. So I will reach out to, I can do some research on, and maybe even ask Dan, who is responsible for carrying out the Montpelier policy.
Okay.
And then invite the couple of advocates that I spoke to there, and then reach out to Lacey to get the contact for folks in Brattleboro as well. And then after the Parks Commission meeting, I can figure out who might want to come to provide feedback.
Okay. Okay. Update on just cause eviction. I provided you with the latest version, and we can kind of walk through that. It's going to go It is. I didn't double check. I think it's going on the notice calendar for tomorrow. I should have double checked that. And then notice calendar just means sort of like a first reading, and that it really would be discussed on Tuesday. I'm just trying to look that up. Over the last few weeks, I've spent a fair amount of time. Brian joined the House GovOps committee. There was quite a few speakers for and against this. And this is very unusual. It's not unusual at all, actually, but for its charter change, there was a fair amount of time spent on it. And there continues to be the same conversations that we've had locally occurring around it in the State House. So again, I'm not, the House is set to convene tomorrow, and this is, the bill is H708 if you want to look it up online. Committee bill for second reading. So I'm not sure. I am talking to a couple of legislators after this meeting to provide them with some background, and I can drop you a note if I find out anything more. So, but sort of stepping backwards with what we've landed with, I don't know if you all have had a chance to review the changes. And again, not unsurprisingly, there was a lot of concern. The first set of changes added additional clarifying language for just cause reasons. In my opinion, since most of those would be likely lease provisions anyway, and more generally operate under state law, I felt like it was sort of redundant, but I didn't have any problem. And that's on the second page of the bill, if you're looking at it. On the third page, there was an additional provision. Again, I see it as somewhat redundant, about clarifying that a reason for an exemption would be that the property is being sold for owner occupied use, which was sort of consistent with the fact that it would be withdrawn from the market and being occupied by an owner. The third change that was proposed, and be mindful, the context was, interestingly, a fairly strong feeling by most of the committee members that this was, quote, too vague, which was interesting given that, in fact, we evolved this significantly from where we started and added a lot of clarifying language because we were concerned about that. And we had a lot of back and forth discussion about the fact that charter changes generally don't have that level of specificity because that's what you work out in ordinance. And you want to be very careful about putting too much specificity in a charter change, because the only way to undo it is to go back to the voters. The third change, which was not great, but we didn't get a lot of movement on, was to specify a relocation of 1 month's rent or any other amount negotiated by the landlord. And we had quite a bit of conversation about not specifying it or trying to move with a more generic, this covering the costs of relocation, which in our own ordinance, if you have to relocate somebody because of code violations, we have a sort of broader definition. So it sort of depends on the circumstance of what's going on with the request for relocation. This would be somewhat different in the sense that it would be more likely terminating a lease agreement as opposed to a relocation where you'd be relocating somebody. So again, we went back and forth quite a bit on this. I think it's very important to understand the politics of it. This is not something familiar to most legislators. The hurdle we have to get through is getting it out of the House. The Senate's probably likely to be more friendly, but we need to get out of the House. And we need to get it by the governor. And I would say that's significant. I think that's very significant. So I think that's something we need to keep in mind. I mean, be mindful, my other party legislative experience, that he vetoed the statewide rental registry, and what I feel is a very not a heavy duty bill around moving code enforcement from volunteer town officers to the Department of Public Safety. And that's a battle still being fought, and there's a high likelihood it could get vetoed again. So I just think that's an environment that we have to be very, very conscious of. There are a lot of people in the House of Representatives who are landlords. And I think a few years ago, Brian might remember this, there was a big, it's probably 7 days article about the House of Landlords. And I would venture to say that hasn't changed a lot. So that's the political dynamic. The other two things that came up was we had, and this is relative to Jess Hyman's comments, the current charter change language allowed for a probation period after initial occupancy, but we did not specify it. They added in the 1 year. And I will say Representative John Gannon, who is on the House GovOps committee, did a lot of homework. I mean, he's an attorney. He read the other state statutes. He really did know them. 3 of them have a 1 year probation period, and I'm sure that's where that came from. The 2 biggest states, Oregon and California, have a 1 year period. And they were fairly insistent on putting that in. And I think it's very important for getting a high majority of votes in the House that we have Representative Gannon's support. The final piece, which had originally been inserted to say that one of the exemptions would be for landlords that owned less than 4 units. And in my opinion, that would have been a deal killer. Both Brian and I did some research, and the way our stock is, about half our stock is 1 to 4 unit buildings, a rental stock. So that would have made no sense. So we spent a significant time going back and forth on that. Like I said, I did that half our stock is that. Brian tried to look at who the owners of the buildings are. And we clearly don't have a good way to identify we know who owns the building. We just don't know much about them. Most real estate these days are owned in LLCs, limited liability corporations. for the express purpose, and you know, lots of individuals do that simply to protect that investment from something personal. So that's, so you don't know sort of who the owners are. And without literally matching up addresses and phone numbers or some such thing like that, we couldn't figure that out. Brian, you determined that about a third of the units are owned in LLCs. Is that what I recall?
That was correct. A third of the units where there's up to 4 units. So it's 1 to 4 unit buildings. A third of them are owned by LLCs, and the labor required for a small city like ours to figure out who's behind the LLC is just onerous. So we were able to persuade them that burden on local government was just too much, and they heard that.
We're honestly, without having any discussion with others, and this will go through the ordinance process, we agreed to put softer language about mitigating impacts on small landlords. I'm not sure how that'll play itself out, and we're going to have to figure that out. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a comment and then one question, which is just to say that I'm so grateful for Sarah. She and I fought bitterly about this when this was in front of CDNR. I think Brian originally brought this, and then mostly Sarah and I duked it out on what it actually should be. And just to have, I mean, I've been following this process, but not a part of it. And so just to have you and all of your experience, first of all, that we came to agreement eventually, and then to have you just continue to push this forward and be the council rep on it has been obviously so meaningful. And I appreciate kind of all of the political ball you've played to keep it as close to what we had as possible. And then my only question is the shall not exceed the value of 1 month's rent or another amount negotiated by the landlord or tenant. I guess I'm curious if it passes through like this, which I know is still an if, will we be able to say an ordinance that it's like that it is just the 1 month's rent, or is it limiting, or is it somehow holding us to having that or as an option?
Good question. I think we talked about it being a floor, not a limit.
Okay.
Didn't we, Sarah? And I thought
We
Bob
did,
Hoover
yeah.
said that in the room. He said that to John Gannon, that this is a floor, not a ceiling. So, but that will be accomplished not in ordinance per se, but in the negotiation, I think, between an owner and a tenant, which we'll acknowledge there's a huge power imbalance there. So how much power do they have in that negotiation, I think is up for debate, but
Right. But our ordinance can have the floor of 1
yeah,
month's rent.
exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, it says shall not exceed, so I'm not sure if that's.
That was not
Right.
supposed to be, yeah, that's the problem. That was not, I thought it was supposed to be a floor, shall be. I thought it was supposed to be at least, but. That doesn't mean that you can't also. I mean, moving expenses is not rent. You know what I mean? So you could say 1 month's rent and moving expenses and utility.
Well, it's the
Oh.
concept of relocation expense. And maybe we should get that clarified with Dan. I think the 2 areas that we didn't spend a lot of time on were notice, which I thought was a good thing because we have much more latitude there. And we didn't get into the de facto rent increase conversation,
At
which
all.
I was quite sure we were going to, and we did not. Again, Representative Gannon did a lot of homework. The other states do not have relocation expenses in their just cause eviction. So, I don't know that's exclusive, but the bigger programs did not put that in. And then time periods vary depending on what jurisdiction you look at.
And on that probationary period, I haven't asked Dan Richardson if he agrees, but I thought that was problematic, as Jess Hyman raised earlier in her public comments. It doesn't, I don't think, preclude the city from essentially saying, if you terminate within the probationary period, the relocation requirements still can be enacted. I think we could still require relocation assistance in that instance, don't you, Sarah?
It says the ordinance shall exempt from this provision.
Oh, it does.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think the ordinance just doesn't apply at all.
Again, I mean, well, all of California and Oregon have the 1 year, so we can certainly try to research how they've sort of carried that out.
Can I take back what I just said? It says shall exempt, but it also says subject to mitigation provisions. So I think you're right.
I think we
Yeah.
still have that. I think we left it in that you could
Yeah.
we could still through ordinance say, sure, probationary period, 12 months. However, if you terminate in that time period, you've got to mitigate the impact. And that is,
Your memory is better than mine.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're gonna have a full boat of ordinance discussions. Once, so again, it's gonna go to the floor starting tomorrow and presumably a final vote on Tuesday. I'm not clear on that, but yeah, actually I'm pretty clear. That's the timing. And then it needs to go to the Senate. So the Senate is more likely to be supportive and more likely to vote on party lines. So there's more Democrats and independents in the Senate proportionately. So it probably should go through there. I don't know that GovOps committee as well. My understanding is they tend to more leave local charter changes to the municipality, whether or not they agree with them. The House side exercises a lot more opinion. And be mindful, we had 4 changes. The airport has just gone through. IRB has not moved at all. And the thermal energy proposal came out pretty much as it was, but really had quite a bit of conversation around a carbon impact fee. So while it didn't at the end of the day get changed, well, let me step that back. It's still got to go to House Ways and Means. And so they've got a whole other additional process to go to. Last I heard, unless something comes up on the floor, this will not have to go House General Affairs and Housing, which is a good thing. You just want to avoid as many people touching it as you can. So I talked to Representative Bloomley, and she had talked to Representative Stevens, and he's not going to ask for it, which is a good thing. Joe?
Can you just remind me what the committee vote was on Just Cause?
It was 8-3, so it divided on party lines.
Party lines? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll wait and see what happens. I don't know the speed at which this will move over to the Senate. I can't read that. Unfortunately, on both sides of the houses, they're dealing with reapportionment. So that's been, you've sort of had to wedge in between that. In one fashion, that probably helped us not have to go to other committees. It probably hurt us some because there was a sense of, we got to agree to this and let's get out of committee, and here's what 8 of us want. And you sort of almost get stuck with it. It wasn't like we had huge negotiating power around this, because they can just sit on it. But for lack of default. And I don't know what's going to happen, for example, with IRV. It's being sat upon right at the minute. And I haven't heard any strategy around that. The strategy, or the word is, well, we'll get to it after reapportionment, but reapportionment's a big deal. So that could stretch on for the rest of the session.
And we haven't even seen maps from the Senate yet, so.
Right. And that's going to be, I mean, the House reapportionment has been, once they kind of got over the 2-person, 1-person district thing, most of it's been quite locally nuanced and not, to my knowledge, I mean, there's huge fights. I happened to sit when I was waiting to testify before the reapportionment of Rutland City and Rutland Town, and they certainly had quite a bit to say about it. So, there's a lot of that going on, but not so much affecting us. I think the Senate reapportionment, because it's going to divide Chittenden County, will be huge, a huge discussion. And something we all need to be very mindful of, because it will divide the city from the burbs. But that's a whole other political conversation to be had. So I don't know, that's my update. Any other kind of questions or?
No, I think so.
We should probably, well, it's getting the cart before the horse, but soon enough, I'll check in with the city attorney, but in terms of formulating ordinance, I mean, I see that as a big piece of work, and it really won't necessarily be this committee, but I think this committee may want to think about weighing in, at least sort of philosophically, on some of the stuff, before it gets to ordinance type language. Okay. Brian, do you have any other updates or other business for us?
No, we are, making progress on the various ARPA funded initiatives around homelessness that you all funded recently, and hope to have some, milestones achieved pretty soon with that. There are proposals were due today on vendors to bring us the shelter pods, so we'll know pretty soon what we got. We have a hiring process that I think it closes a week from today or tomorrow to fill a position of special assistant and homelessness. So we're moving with, due haste on that one as well.
I just have a quick question about that. What's the process you all are going through for finding a location for the shelter pods?
That's a good question. We have probably, I'd say we're pretty close to having some a recommendation to you all that the council will be, sort of the first step in the process, I think, because the project, the whatever use, wherever it is, will have to go through the permit process. It's not like the city gets to, sort of bypass that. So we have to submit an application for that. There was a list of, 8 or 10 potential sites and a matrix of different criteria, zoning, neighbors, access to infrastructure, proximity to services, all of that. So
Okay.
we'll be in touch soon about that, though.
Okay, great.
That's it.
Okay. Just a check-in, because we had moved the meeting to 5. Is that still okay with folks, or do you want to go back to 5:30?
I'm okay with either, despite the fact that I missed it today. And I'm sorry, it's just because public
Okay.
safety was also at 5, and then we changed it to 5:30 that it got
Okay.
muddled in my mind, but
5 is good.
I like 5, but I'm open, so,
Works
Any-
well on our end too.
okay.
Once we get to end the night a little bit earlier is.
Yeah.
You get a dinner just before, not just before going to bed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
second,
All in favor?
I.
Aye, okay.
Yeah.
Alrighty, thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone. Have a good night.
Bye, everyone.
Right.